Week 9 is in the books. That means it's time to hit those waiver wires to find players that could add value to the back end of your rosters. And first and foremost, I want to highlight a couple of players that are already very highly rostered, but not exactly 100% that I think need to be. And that includes Sean Tucker, running back for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Juwan Jennings, wide receiver for the San Francisco 49ers, Brandon Cooks, wide receiver for the Dallas Cowboys, Adam Thielen, wide receiver for the Carolina Panthers, Parker Washington, wide receiver for the Jacksonville Jaguars, Juwan Jennings, tight end for the New Orleans Saints, and Jatavion Sanders, tight end for the Carolina Panthers. Again, all these guys are already very rostered in over 90% of Dynasty leagues out there, but not exactly 100%. So double check your waiver wires and add these guys if they are available. All right, spoiler alert. Week 9 was not very friendly to us with injuries. Perhaps the biggest injury on the week with the most fantasy implications was Dak Prescott leaving with a hamstring injury, and in his place comes Cooper Rush, who actually is very familiar with taking over for Dak in his career. His last game started being back in 2022 and once in 2021. Actually, in 6 starts, Rush has thrown for over 215 yards in 4 of those games, including one 300-yard game, and he's thrown at least 1 touchdown in all but 1 game, with 2 multi-touchdown games. Then this week, in just 1 quarter of play, threw for 115 yards and a touchdown on 25 pass attempts. So if Dak actually ends up missing multiple games, Rush is a fairly decent backup option in an offense that has required a ton of volume to even try to win games this year, and of course, has CeeDee Lamb, Jake Ferguson, Jalen Tolbert, and Brandon Cook set to return from IR. If we find out over the next day or two that Dak Prescott is set to miss multiple games, then Rush should be a 100% fab dump for whatever you have left to go get him. Now, a far lesser quarterback pickup option this week, if you have an extra roster spot and you really don't know who to add, I think there are worse pickups out there than Desmond Ridder. Gardner Minshew once again started and was benched mid-game for the second time this year, except this time for the newly acquired Desmond Ridder, who did end the game with a very nice touchdown throw to Brock Bowers. Now, we know Desmond Ridder really isn't a very good quarterback. He didn't do all that much for fantasy football, even with Drake London and Kyle Pitts and Bijan Robinson, but granted, maybe that's more on Arthur Smith than Desmond Ridder, but it's also not like the Raiders' offense is much better, especially in terms of actual talent. But who knows? Maybe Ridder starts the rest of the year and can give you a random QB2 spot start as bye weeks continue for a few more weeks, plus we're getting more quarterback injuries every single week. All right, the only running back on this list this week is more of an insurance ad than anything in Amari DiMercato. We got our first James Conner injury scare this week after he got hurt almost scoring and then sat out through halftime before returning in the third quarter. I feel like everyone is just kind of waiting for Conner to actually miss games because he's never shown the ability to play all 17, especially in Arizona the past few years. The expectation is that Trey Benson is the primary handcuff, which he did finish the drive that Conner got hurt during with a touchdown at the goal line. But the very next drive, DiMercato broke off a 53-yard touchdown, and he was more involved in the receiving game than Trey Benson. For a handcuff option that's still available in nearly 40% of MFL leagues that I'm pulling from, maybe even more on Sleeper, he is definitely a great end-of-bench stash right now, just in case Conner really does get hurt. Now, before we hit wide receivers, I just wanted to bring up Grant Calcaterra, the backup Eagles tight end who has been getting a bigger role with Dallas Goedert out. He's actually been quite consistent over the past few weeks with 8+ fantasy points in 3 of their last 4 games, and he could still have a bigger role even when Goddard returns because A.J. Brown left this week with a knee injury. So if Philadelphia decides to play more 12 personnel as their base package now with A.J. Brown out, Calcaterra could be a decent long shot play at tight end if you really need someone when Dallas Goedert is back, or a somewhat safer option for like not a donut kind of play if Dallas Goedert continues to miss games, especially if A.J. Brown really misses time. All right, moving to wide receiver, one player that I left off the list last week that 100% should have been named is Jalen Coker of the Carolina Panthers. He had a strong game last week with 78 yards and a touchdown, but came crashing back down to earth this week with 36 yards on just 2 catches. Honestly, I really don't think that Coker is anything special. He had a splash week against a good defense, and that caught everybody's attention, especially after they traded away Deontay Johnson this week, but Xavier Legette is just much better in my opinion. He has the draft capital to back it up. Jatavion Sanders continues to look good as a receiving option, plus Adam Thielen is set to return from IR, assuming that he's also not traded by Tuesday. I also do expect the Carolina Panthers to continue to add wide receivers to this team next offseason, either through free agency or the draft, so Coker might just be a fun name now with absolutely zero relevance in 3 months, but he is worth a roster spot today regardless, so if he's still available, I think you can pick him up. But speaking of wide receivers who could benefit from players being traded away, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine has quietly scored a touchdown in 4 straight weeks. He's also had at least 4 targets in 3 straight games, including season highs across the board this weekend, with 5 receptions, 50 yards, and a touchdown on 6 targets. With DeAndre Hopkins no longer on the team, NWI is effectively the Titans wide receiver 2 behind Calvin Ridley, and is really not a stranger to relevance for fantasy off the Dynasty waiver wire. He's not the flashiest name that you can add this week, but might be more helpful than you think as we close the season. All right, now it's time for the sad part of the video. It is time to talk about some of these big wide receiver injuries, starting with the Atlanta Falcons, with Drake London leaving early with a hip injury, leaving Darnell Mooney as the de facto wide receiver 1, and Ray McCloud as the wide receiver 2. Now, McCloud didn't really have a huge game after London went down, only 28 yards on 3 catches, but he did find the end zone to put his fantasy day over double digits. McCloud has had some big games already this year as the Falcons wide receiver 3, including 6 for 52 against the Saints and 6 for 66 against Tampa Bay, both games seeing 7 or more targets. So if London misses time and McCloud starts seeing decent volume, he could be a sneaky flex start, especially in these very high scoring games for the Falcons. Now, the other big wide receiver injury this week was Chris Olave, which was a way scarier injury than London after another concussion and immediate hospital visit. So hopefully all is okay there for Chris Olave, but in his place from a fantasy perspective would be Cedric Wilson as the team's wide receiver 1, now that Bub Means is on IR, and of course Rashid Shaheed is out for the season. Now, Wilson didn't do all that much today, just 2 catches for 34 yards, but he is also not a stranger to fantasy relevance, most notably from his time in Dallas a few years ago. In fact, in 9 games where he's played at least 65% of snaps, Wilson averages 5 targets and 47 yards per game, and he has scored 5 touchdowns in those 9 games, equaling 11.1 fantasy points per game. This also includes the Saints game in week 7 this year against the Broncos, where he caught 6 passes for 57 yards and a touchdown, which was also a game without Chris Olave. I really wouldn't be surprised if Olave gets the Tua treatment here after having back-to-back concussions, and in an offense already with, like I said, no Rashid Shaheed, no Bub Means, Wilson could be thrust into a high volume role for the next month or so he needs to be added everywhere.